All right, in this section, I just want to hit on St. Peter. This section's all about St. Peter's role, and it's pretty hard to look at scriptures and look at Christ and look at the apostles, look at St. Peter, and not see that Peter is unique amongst the 12, right? It's pretty hard to not see that Peter's always speaking up for the 12. It's hard to not see that Jesus has a relationship with Peter that's different than with the others. So we want to highlight Peter and not only how Christ, through scriptures, pulls him out from the others, but also how Peter and what Christ does with Peter fits with the Old Testament and Christ establishing and creating a kingdom. And so when we look at the early church and the role of St. Peter, we see that his role and St. Peter have to be there, really, for the early church to be connected to the kingdom, the Old Testament covenant, and what Christ wants, which is what he always talks about, a kingdom, right? Without Peter, without his role, we're going to see through hopefully the next couple scriptural texts that it doesn't make sense, okay? So here we go, moving forward. First, this is a catechism quote from our textbook. I just want to highlight it and point out what it's talking about. This is sort of this section in a nutshell. Catechism number 553. And it summarizes everything in these short sentences. And it says that Jesus entrusted a specific authority to Peter, right? Specific authority to Peter, right? Above the others, right? And where do we see that? When Jesus says in Matthew 16, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, right? That's what Jesus is all about, talking about the kingdom of heaven. But what we've seen is he's establishing that kingdom of heaven, and it's going to have a visible body and a visible place here on earth, right? That we're going to be able to see it. And that's what Christ calls his church, right? And why he chooses the 12. Okay, then this next part, that specific authority has to do with binding and things being bound in heaven, and loosing on earth and things being loosed in heaven, right? What is that all about? Well, the church calls that the power of the keys, and we're going to see what that means, right? What is the power of the keys? It's designating a certain authority to govern the house of God. And this phrase is connected to Isaiah 22, which we're going to look at in a second. Isaiah chapter 22. It talks about the house of Judah, the house of David, the house of the kingdom. Right? That's why we have in this catechism reference to authority to govern the house of God. So we'll see that next slide. What is the house of God, right? The church itself. And okay, Jesus, the good shepherd, confirms this mandate after his resurrection. Remember, on the shores after his resurrection, Jesus encounters Peter and he says, do you love me 3 times? And Peter says, yes. And he says to him something along these lines each time. Feed my sheep, tend my flock, right? Jesus is the shepherd. It's his flock. But he's telling Peter, you have a unique role, right? You are to be the shepherd, right? You're to take care of my sheep. You're supposed to protect them, right? So on and so forth, right? He has a unique role because Christ is leaving, right? So we're not going to be sheep without a shepherd. We have Christ, yes. But Christ specifically, right, tells us in Scripture that he is establishing Peter and the office of Peter to be there for us, right? So if we come in later and we say, oh, the Pope and the church and the role of the Pope is made up and sometime in the centuries after Jesus or in the New Testament, or it's some role that the church makes up to hold us down and to have authority, we just need to go to Jesus. Well, if we go to Jesus and we look at Jesus, Jesus is saying to Peter, here is your role on earth, right? You are to shepherd my people, the church, right? So Peter, you have a specific role. So if we deny Peter and his role, we're really denying what Jesus is setting up and establishing, right? Okay, continuing on. The power to bind and loose, what's that all about? Well, what is binding and loosing? In a regular kingdom, that is being able to have the authority of the king. Well, what's the authority of the king in the kingdom of heaven, right? Well, remember what we've said all along the Old Testament has led us to. This is all about sin and forgiveness of sin, right? So what's he saying here? What he said to the apostles before, you have the power to bind and loose. He's saying specifically, Peter, you have this authority to absolve sins, right, in the name of the king, right? To pronounce doctrinal judgments, that is, to protect the king's edicts, right? To give out the edicts of the king, right, in the kingdom, right? To make the decrees of the king, so on and so forth. and to make disciplinary actions. You can bind and loose, you can put people in prison or not, right? And then that comes down to if they were talking about the earthly church, right? That has to do with physical things that are going on, right? So Peter, the Pope, has this authority in the church to do these things. Jesus entrusts this authority to the church through the ministry of the apostles, right? But in particular, what we're saying, though, is that through the ministry of St. Peter, he is the only one who Jesus specifically says, you have the keys of the kingdom, which is a sign of authority, which we're going to see right now in the next few slides. So mainly this is coming from Isaiah 22. In Isaiah 22, the prophet Isaiah is talking to this guy, Shebna, who is in charge of the royal household. What we just saw on the last slide, in charge of the church, the kingdom of God, right? In charge of the royal household. Here's where we're getting that from. This guy, Shebna, the King David has 12 chief ministers, okay? There is one among the 12 who is the prime minister, the chief of the 12 chief ministers. Think of the cabinet and the presidency, right? So he's talking to this guy. And mainly in this paragraph, he's saying, what in the world have you done? You have made a tomb for yourself. You've made this fancy looking place, right? In other words, this guy, the prime minister, we're going to see, has authority and power given by the king himself. That's his office. He has amazing authority and power. And he doesn't use it in the name of the king, and he doesn't use it for the kingdom and for the king's sake. But this guy is pretty much abusing his power. And that's what Isaiah is coming to tell him. What in the world? Behold, the Lord is about to hurl you headlong. Look out, right? You are going to be cast out, right? You will die and da-da-da-da-da. You are a shame on your master's house. In other words, you've been given power by the king, and you're a shame on the kingdom because of your abuse of the power. I will depose you from your office, and I will put you down from your station. Then I will summon this guy, and I will clothe him in your tunic, and I will give him your sash, and I will entrust him with your authority. In other words, he will become a father of the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of Judah. That's what we see, that house in the last slide. What's this all saying? It's saying that in the kingdom, here's what's important. It's saying there is an office of a prime minister, right, who has authority of the king, who is to be a father of the inhabitants, right? And this guy, right, when he is thrown out by God, his office remains, right? It's not like the prime minister disappears because this guy has abused power. But mainly there's an office of prime minister with the authority of the king, who's to take hold and is in charge of the royal household. And somebody's going to fill that office when this guy leaves. That's what's going on. The sign of the king, of this power, of this office, of the authority, here's what we see. I will set the key of the house of David. That is, the keys of the kingdom will be on his shoulder. In the olden days, the king itself was huge, and they actually put it on their shoulder because it was so large, right? And get this, when he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open. In other words, the sign of the authority of this office is keys of the kingdom. And he has the authority of the king to open and shut, shut and open, bind and loose, da-da-da-da-da. Sound familiar, right? And he is in charge of the royal household. So this language of the kingdom and the role of the kingdom is what we see when we go to Jesus in Matthew's gospel. When Peter says to Jesus, you are the Christ, right? And David was the Christ figure. And that's when Jesus says, I'm going to build my church, my kingdom. And here's where he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom. In other words, right, you have just said that I am David's successor, right? And Jesus is saying, you're right. I am the king, the new king. And you're right, Peter, you are going to be my prime minister, right? you are going to be the one who's in charge of the world household. You're the one is going to be the father of its inhabitants. Think of Jesus when he says, "You feed my lambs," right? Tend my sheep. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. In other words, Jesus is making this perfect connection from Matthew 16 to Isaiah 22, saying, right, that if I'm going to establish a kingdom, then that kingdom is going to look just like the kingdom of the Old Testament, but perfected. And it's going to have a prime minister. So mainly what we want to say here then is, if we're going to say that Jesus is establishing a kingdom, but we're not going to accept the role of Peter and the Pope, we are saying we are rejecting the way Christ is setting up, and we are saying we are rejecting the way it was set up in the Old Testament, and we're saying that, I'm sorry, Jesus, what you're saying doesn't really fit with us, right? Mainly what we're saying with Peter, and we'll see in our next little set, is that this role of Peter's primacy and this role of Peter's authority is established by Christ, not by the church, and is connecting to the Old Testament and fulfilling the Old Testament. So if you don't have Peter's role as Pope, right, and his prime minister role, well, then you don't have a connection to the Old Covenant. But Jesus is clearly fulfilling and perfecting the Old Covenant. And so in so doing, this role makes perfect sense. And we see that in the early church.